I'm your 3D CG guru, Nathaniel Albright, and this is part 2 of my video series on Cascadeur where I'm attempting to do a speed run. I don't know how fast I'm going, but in this video, these are the topics that we'll be covering. Also, if you want to follow along with the videos, I've gone ahead and included some of the animation files that I use in this video in the description down below. So go ahead and get those downloaded if you want. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. One thing that we didn't really cover yet is the ability to silhouette our scene. So obviously, if we turn on a silhouette, it really allows us to focus on the readability of a pose. And that's a really nice little built-in feature there. To the left of that, we also have some ghosting options here. There's the little dot, and I'm going to go ahead and expand that. You'll see a number of choices, so I can ghost the previous frame, the next frame, both the previous and next frame. And then finally, I can ghost a selection right here. The ghosts that we see, we can also click on this little human silhouette icon here to actually get an outline of each of those ghosts. And there's also a key option here. So if we only want to see ghosts of the animated keys, we can do that. Finally, the other option that we have when we don't have key enabled is we can choose, as long as we have anything other than the selection range, so the before and after neighboring frames, we can choose how many frames before and how many frames after of the ghost we actually see in the viewport. The one thing that you're not going to find that I hope they bring to this at some point is the ability to ghost before and after the current frame, but at certain intervals. So it'd be nice to see like every third frame or every fifth frame, but that's not really an option right now if you're used to that choice. One way I use ghosts inside of Cascadeur is if I have a run in place animation and I want to get that character to run through space, rather than me having to guess where the foot might plant. Instead, I can just grab this. I could select my time range. I'll go into interval edit mode here, and I'll set this to a linear line. I'll go ahead and enable ghosts for my selection like so, and then I can just start to pull this out, and I'll come in here and just find the point where the foot looks like it's planting. Let me go ahead and give myself a little more space in the viewport here. So here I can do this and I get my foot roll, the tips of my toes on the foot roll happening, so I know that I have a nice even distribution to my run cycle that's now happening through space. Now, one nice feature they have inside of Cascadeur, if you want to follow a run cycle, rather than it being in place, we can also just say select the center of mass, for example, and over here to the right, we have some options for tracking an object with the view. So now, even though he's moving through space, I'm going to go ahead and turn my ghost off here. It looks like he's kind of running in place instead. One thing that would be nice to have that we don't have an option for currently is the ability to maybe eliminate something like not tracking on the height so we can see the bounce. Right now it just tracks whatever object you have selected, and if you want to lock that so you can select something different, you just hit the little lock icon there to lock the selected object that the camera is tracking. When we're done tracking, we can go ahead and just turn that off. Well, with a run cycle already loaded up here inside of Cascadeur, this is probably a good time to talk about the cycle tools that we have on the timeline, which are located over here to the far left. I'm going to start with a simple object. So I'm going to go to the commands menu, go to add, and I'm going to add a locator. Just so everyone's aware that when you add an object, I believe it adds the object to whatever track you currently have active. And you can see what track an object is assigned to over in the object properties panel. The behavior that contains this information is initially marked as not visible. So if you want to see that behavior that's hidden, you can go up here to the top right. There's the little eyeball, and if you click on that, you'll see there's a behavior here called additional info, and that actually gives me the track information. Now, for me, I don't want this associated with the character at all. So I need to restructure my folders and my tracks a little bit. So we're going to do that first. I'm going to go down here. One thing to also mention, before we even get to making more tracks and folders, is on the far right side is this option to have the tracks automatically expand. So as you open things up, the track list here expands so you can see everything. So I like to have that enabled. And what I really want to do is, rather than have the character be the root structure of my tracks folder, I want one folder above that. Now, to the bottom left, on the far left side, is an add folder button. When I do that, if you have something selected, it's going to try to add that object to it, which in this case, I'm going to just cancel. I don't want to do that. So let me click away, and then I'll say add folder, and then I can choose what I want to call this. So we'll just go with the default. Now, by default, this is right next to all of the parts that make this character up. So I'm going to take and select all these tracks and drag and drop it into here. And now I have a subfolder here where standard mail, if I right click, I can copy this, and then I'll right click on my folder 0 and name that standard mail. And then I'll go back to this original folder here and I'll call this scene, like so. Okay, now I could go in and I can make a new folder here, and let me go ahead and select my locator. And now with the scene selected, I'm going to go to the bottom left again, and just to the left of add folder is add track, and I'll say okay. And now we get the locator here. And if I want to verify that it did indeed move to the new track, once again, I can just go over here and confirm. If it didn't move it, I can always add it to the new track. And I would do that by selecting the objects that I want, selecting the track that I want them to go to, and then there's the icon here with add objects to track, and I could just go ahead and click on that there. The other things you'll see here is we can combine tracks together, and also if I have a track I no longer need, I can remove the track. Now for this locator, because it was originally added to the body track that had keys on every frame, it added keys to the locator on every frame. I'm going to go ahead and select all those keys, and I'll just do Alt F to remove. The Alt F is an add or remove kind of toggle, so in this case it just clears everything. So now the locator has a key just on frame 0, and then I have my character. And actually, I kind of messed things up here. I didn't actually need to create this locator 0 because when you make a folder, it includes a track with it. So now I have this one track 0 I don't need at all. So I'm going to go ahead and just select that track and then hit the delete. And this is what we get at the end. All right, so let's talk about cycles a little bit. I'm going to go to my front view and we'll just remove the perspective. I'm going to grab my locator here. I'm just going to add 3 simple keys. So here's a key. Let's move this up in space, and forgot to set a key first, and we'll move that like so. I'm also going to make sure that my trajectory is showing this. So we have this, and then if I go back down, let's just copy this key. So shift, middle click, drag, we'll do something like that. So my locator is going back and forth. Let's grab these keys and I'll set those to the Bezier, or I could have done Alt B as a shortcut for that. And actually, to make this a little bit easier to see what's happening with the cycle options, I'm going to take this last key and move it over. Okay, so what the default cycle option does is it attempts to take the last key and put it as a key that happened before the first key and vice versa. So my last key is going to have some information about the upcoming key. And it's going to try to bridge those together so that we have a kind of continuous trajectory. And we can do that by going and selecting the range that represents our cycle. And then over here to the left, we have this middle button here. It says create cycle. And when I click on that, you'll see here we get this pink line showing the connection between the last frame and the first frame. And then with that information, it can now use these keys to actually give us a trajectory as if it was a continuous cycle. So now this is cycling around like so. The other thing I can do here is I could grab this and I could resize the cycle. So if I go just to the right of where the cycle occurs, and I should also mention when you enable that cycle, you'll get a kind of color coding around the box that represents the frames that have been cycled. And to the right of this last key is a little mini key that pops up when my cursor goes over it, and I can click and drag, and this will just expand this out. So now I get this happening. So it's adding these extra keys into my scene. Now I can always go back to this key and I can make adjustments. You'll see here the closer I bring this to being on top of the first key, the trajectory of that motion is lessened, so I don't get as big of an arc happening then. Once I'm happy with my cycle, I can just hit the remove cycles button, and then those keys are essentially kind of baked down. Now in this case, notice that the first cycle and the last cycle at this point don't maintain their original shape, because since the cycle is broken, this key doesn't have the right trajectory and this one doesn't have the right trajectory, but the middle cycle here does match the loop that we had before. Now, if I want to do this differently, what I could do is I could select these keys and I could set those to be fixed. So now when I remove the cycle, everything will maintain the loop like so. All right, and remember, fix is almost just kind of like baking those keys. So there we go. Now, one thing worth mentioning is you'll notice that when I repeated the cycle, the first key of the cycle was stacked right next to the last key of the cycle. And so in this case, for this particular animation, they don't represent the same pose. When we actually get to my character, you're going to see the first frame matches the last frame. So when I'm doing a cycle on my actual character here, I don't want to grab the entire frame range. I want to grab the entire frame range minus the last key. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. You'll see to the left of the center cycle button, there are two additional choices here. There's a cycle with position and rotation offsets, and then there's a cycle with just position offset. In my case, my character's running straight. There shouldn't be any slight orientational shifts happening to that character. If there are, that's a flaw. I really want this character to run in a straight line. So I'm going to go ahead and just choose the far left cycle option here. Here you'll see once again with this, get this color coding of orange, letting me know it's a cycle with just positional offsets only. And then to the right of my last key I chose a cycle, I get this box, and I can click and drag this and expand this out like so, and that will give me this character now running through space. Now I'm going to go ahead and undo this. If I chose the other one, what would happen here? Let's grab this. I'm going to do the cycle with position and rotation offsets. We get the kind of purple outline now. My character shouldn't look any different. It's still going straight, but I could go to this last key and I could do something strange, like let's grab this center of mass here on this key and I'll give it like a rotate. And let me just make sure that was on the world. So now you'll see every beginning of every cycle, that character actually moves by whatever amount of rotation I added to that first key of the new cycle. All right, so some slightly different options that we can use there. And the other thing here that we have is this cycle resizing, which is on by default. And all that's really doing is that is allowing me to actually expand the cycle range, or if I want to shift the start and end frame, if I chose something wrong there in the cycle there, I can make adjustments of where the cycle starts and ends. And when that's off, I really can't modify anything about this. And then once again, you could always just remove the cycle once we're done. If you chose to not have cycles go as long, then you can obviously go in here and just delete the keys. In a moment, we'll use this blocked-in animation to explore Cascadeur's physics systems. But before we do that, I'm going to start by using this animation to discuss the Tween Machine that we have. Let me just show everyone what the animation is. It's fairly simple. We just a basic jump. There's definitely issues with this. The landing feels completely flat. There's no weight to the impact. And that's one of those things the physics systems will improve. Another thing is I feel like when the hands lift, I almost want an anticipation to that. I'm going to show you guys one little kind of trick I can do. So let's say I like this timing between 0 and 13, but I want to add some animation before this happens. So what I'll do is I will expand my timeline by 1 frame, just hitting the plus key. Then I'm going to take this pose and I'm just going to clone it. Now I'll go back to frame 0 and I'll add some more frames in here. And just because of the interpolation, we're actually going to get some type of anticipation to that initial windup. So we get a little sway back. Now the arms do kind of hyperextend or lock out here, which I always really hate to see. So I'm going to go to my arms and I'm just going to go in here and make sure that that's a FK interpolation happening here so that there's no type of hyperextension. And so we get this. Okay, so let's talk about the Tween Machine. There's quite a few settings. I do have a other video posted on YouTube where I use the Tween Machine to do some mocap cleanup. So some of these features I'm not going to really go into that much. And as this is supposed to be a speed run, I shouldn't really be going too deep into any tools anyway. But let me go ahead and we'll just explore this set of options here real quick. So if I have a arm like this hand here, you'll see I have some keyframes. Let me go ahead and collapse this here. What I want to do is I essentially maybe want to offset this so I don't have such a symmetrical animation happening here. Maybe I want this hand dropping to the ground sooner. I'm going to go ahead and just enable my ghost so everyone can see what I'm talking about here. And I'm just going to select this timeline here, and let's make sure my ghost options are set. So I want to see before and after. I'm going to see everything in my selected range. I'm going to select from 60 over to here on the impact, and I'll say, yeah, show keys only. Okay, so here we go. Here's my hand. Let's turn off the trajectory. And what I want to do is I want to blend this hand down towards the ground, or maybe I want it to suspend a little higher. So we have this set to previous next, so I can simply select this and I can go to the previous pose or the next pose. And right now, let me make sure I have this relative off. If this is set to global, the arm is going to literally try to reach down to the position of the hand in world space. Or I go to previous, it's going to reach up. Now notice here, if I go too far, the limbs are going to actually start to move the center of the body here, which looks odd. So if you don't like that behavior, you can go into the Tween Machine Advanced, and there's two types of relaxation modes. The relaxation is really Cascadeur's term for running the underlying physics collider. So the way it works is you have your animation data, and that's an initial pass, and then the colliders that we have on the character, those positions are resolved. So if the arm colliders are pulling on the upper body colliders, it'll move those. And then we have another round of iteration of resolving the bone joints based off of those collider positions. So that's the relaxation. It's just almost like a physics pass, and we have a pre and post pass. Now on frame, if we do it on a frame, that physics collision or physics pass is more complex, where it'll actually pull on colliders. But if I set this to interpolation, interpolation physics is a more simplistic formula. So now if I actually go to the next, you'll see it really is just impacting those arms here, and I'm not really able to pull the upper body. So you might want to do that like so. The other thing I could do is, rather than being in global space, I could say I want this to be in local space. So here's just going to match the rotations of the body to the next frame or the previous frame, and it's just going to do that relative to the parent. So I could do something like this or this. The other thing I could do here as well is I could make this relative. So if I said relative and then I, right click to make the shoulder the relative object, then I get something like this. And so I get a little bit of that pull, but it's not going to do anything too extreme. I could also maybe do something, here. I don't really have a good example of using the relative in this case, but this is essentially what the arm looks like relative to the hips in the previous pose, or this is what the hand looks like relative to the position of the hips in the next pose. All right, so those are some really nice options you have for quickly offsetting and delaying your animation or speeding parts of your animation up to the neighboring frames. Shouldn't really say speed up, but match the posing of. So I could do the same thing here. Maybe this foot, I don't want that to really come down at such a symmetrical pose. And let's go ahead and just make that global. So I could maybe pull that up a little bit like so. So now I have some asymmetry to this animation. Now there are a couple other choices we have. The inverse forward inertia. I haven't actually played with that one too much, so I can't speak too much on when you would select that. And then finally, the last one is this interpolation and average, and that one I use inside of the mocap cleanup video. It's going to be really nice for essentially smoothing out a series of keyframes. So check that video out for more details there. Inside of the Tween Machine Advanced, you can see there's some filtering you can do in terms of what actually is interpolated and not interpolated. I think though for this speed run, that's a good introduction of where you may want to go if you want to kind of adjust your poses a little bit in an intuitive manner. This is probably also a good time to quickly mention the mirror tools in here. If I select everything and go into here, you'll see we have these options for what plane we want to mirror animation or pose across. And if you're not actually animating directly on a world plane, you could also, pick 3 points, because 3 points make up a plane, to define some type of like off-axis type plane. So maybe I have this and I want to kind of flip these 2 arms. I could just double click while holding down shift and select both of those arms, and I could say mirror. In this case, I want to use the X plane, and I'll just mirror the current frame, and we can kind of flip this there like that. So anyway, there's the mirror tool. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. This is also a good time to just talk about the copying tools. Now, Cascadeur has a lot of options about how you can copy and paste data, probably more than I want to do in this video, but I will mention that outside of just the copier options here, if you go into this edit menu, there's some really interesting options about how you can paste stuff into intervals or copy paste into whole tracks. It can get quite complicated, but it's really flexible, especially if you want to copy things between different characters. But let's go ahead and look at a simple example here. So I have this foot position on this frame, and if I shift D to go to my next frame, here's my foot position. And so I want to copy and paste this pose to this pose. So I'm going to go ahead and select this, and I'll go ahead and do Control C to copy. When you copy these controllers, it collects both the global and local information for those selected points. So when you paste is really when you need to make the choice of global or local. So if I go in here and I hit tilde to switch this to global space and I control V, you'll see it's going to move that foot up into the world space of where the foot was on the previous frame, which I don't want. So I'll control Z to undo that. Now, if I hit tilde to switch this to local space and I control V to paste, now if we look at the foot position relative to the knee, which is the parent, essentially the local space here, that looks correct. However, that's maybe not what I wanted. Maybe what I really wanted here was I wanted this angle of the foot relative to this object over here. So I'm going to right click to make this the relative parent, and I will copy, and then I'm going to go back to this pose here, and then I'll turn on relative into my paste options, and then I'll control V like so, and now I get these angles matching relative to one another and the foot stretching out. So a lot of options, and one thing that's really cool with Cascadeur is that the relative point that you're pasting can be anything in the scene. So if you have two different characters, you can right click to choose anything. It doesn't just have to be controllers that are a part of the same object. It can be any object in space. So really cool, flexible copy paste options. Uh, Having this and using it a lot, I wish there was something like that inside of Maya. In the previous video, there are two things that I kind of glossed over that I want to kind of circle back and talk about in more detail. And the first one of those is the ability to essentially make a controller fixed or unfix it, and that's using the R for the hotkey. I mentioned previously that R is not for scale, it's for making a controller fixed, but we didn't really talk about what that does. And also in the previous video, I mentioned that there is an option for global rotation interpolation, but we didn't really look into what that does exactly. So we'll be doing that now. First, let's talk about fixing a controller. So if I have this hand here and I maybe double click to grab the whole hand and start moving it around, you'll see this begins to pull on the body if my arm gets too far out in space. Maybe I don't want this behavior. So what I can do is I can select something higher up in the hierarchy, like the shoulder here, or maybe at the clavicle at the base of the shoulder, and I can hit R to make this a fixed point. Now when I double click on this controller here and start to move this around, you'll see it does not pull the rest of the body with us or with the arm. It kind of eliminates that unnecessary or maybe undesired pulling that we have. So it's really just fixing the location of an object or a point in space. And same thing here, if I take this hand now and I start to move this, it's going to rotate around those fixed points. So this is really good for making sure that a point in space that you want to stay in space remains in space. And to undo that, just hit R again with those points selected, and it'll deselect those. The global rotation we'll talk about in a moment. So let's scrub through this animation real quick. And when I do this, you're going to see there are a number of issues that we have here. So notice here my feet are slowly kind of rotating between the poses, which is not ideal. I also have some undesirable motions. If we look at kind of from the side view here, the feet are kind of moving around in space during the interpolation. And then when I jump, my character is not really rotating in a believable fashion. And in this spot in particular, my feet are really starting to collapse on themselves. So let's first address the issues of the feet on the ground. And to do this, I'm going to go into my tracks and I'm going to go down to my legs. So one thing that I tend to do, or you'll probably want to do a lot of times when you're on the ground with your legs, is you're going to want to set those to a clamped velocity. And let me make sure I'm just doing that just on the leg track. And the clamp velocity is just going to make sure that the feet really don't shift when they're planted. So before we had, if we go into this area and set it back to just the Bezier, you'll see there's this foot drifting, especially right here. There's quite a bit of motion. So that clamped is just going to really help keep those feet locked in place. Now that doesn't fix the orientational issues of the feet, it's just the interpolation between the poses, but the poses themselves have some issue. So what I want to do is I want to grab the initial standing poses here of these feet and fix this. So I'm going to open up the legs a little bit more to get down to just the foot tracks. Now select this one key here, and we're going to say that I'm going to duplicate this and bring that over to these other spots all the way to, let's say, frame 52. So I'll click on this key, I'll hold down Control, and I'll click on the other right foot, and then I will shift, middle click, and drag over to the next spot. Now, what that shift, middle click, drag is doing is it's essentially copying my keys from one location to the other. However, that copying of the key right now is happening in FK, essentially local space of the bones. And what I want to do is I want to copy the world position. So I'm going to take this key and I'm going to set these keys as being IK keys. So I'll go over here to the left and mark those as IK. And now when I select those and I copy them over, I want to make sure I want to grab just, I don't want to grab the actual legs, just the feet. So let me try that again. I'll hold down Control and then Shift drag. And now I should be able to get those feet to stay in space like so. And then I'll just do this a few more times like this, like this. And you'll see that we get some blue and red lines happening here. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so now my feet are kind of locked. And so the red lines represent some type of stretching. Essentially, the length of these points when they're red is longer than it should be. When it's blue, they're actually shorter than they should be. And an easy way to fix this is just to grab the controllers and hit R and then R again. So that will fix the lengths in any location where they're problematic. So I can do Shift D and just kind of jump through space real quick. And when I see the problems, just tap like that and just fix that up. All right, so there we go. All right, so we have the clamped interpolation on the legs now, and we've copied the keys in IK space so that everything gives me like a nice stable foot plant on my legs. Now when I'm jumping in the air, the legs right now kind of go through themselves. And really, you know, if my feet are on the ground and I want them to stay planted, having IK interpolation makes sense. But if my limbs are free and in space, I'm going to want FK rotation on those keys because it's going to create nice smooth arcs. So what's really happening here in this particular spot is when I'm going from uh, this pose to the previous pose, the feet are just trying to travel on a straight line, which is what happens when we interpolate with IK. And so during that interpolation, it just goes through the body. So what I could do to fix this is I could select these keys here for my legs, and I could just marquee select or select the time range or where the foot is in the air. And I could switch this from IK keys to FK keys like so. And now you'll see that the rotation behaves the way we'd expect. Now, for the limbs in particular, like the legs and arms, one option that's even more likely to be better than an FK interpolation is a global rotation. And the global rotation might be a little challenging for me to explain, but I'll try my best here. So let me go ahead and turn on a trajectory. And before we get to that, let's just talk about the way we can see this interpolation. So right now, my arms, if I look at my track here, they're currently set to an IK interpolation. Notice that the main points here, the keyframes here and here, show that we're kind of producing a linear interpolation from one point to the other. What's interesting here with Cascadeur is they actually do some smoothing. So even though I'm doing a IK interpolation from one keyframe to another, I'm not getting this really straight linear line. I'm actually still getting some curvature to this, which is really quite cool, especially when I'm mixing IK and FK together. I don't just get this sudden redirection in my motion. The interpolation kind of curves around. So there is not necessarily such a linear path that you would get in an application like Maya. Now, if I switch this over to FK, you'll see now we're actually producing more of these kind of rounded arcs like we might expect. The arm, let's go back to this section back here when the flip happens. So now the hand is really producing a nice circular arc like you would expect. Now, that interpolation is influenced by, I believe, the up vector of the joint above it. And so that means that that interpolation could be, if I actually go back to this arm, I'm going to lock it here. And so now I can select this other control. So let's see what happens here if I start to move this here. You'll see that the interpolation path of that hand is being influenced by the orientation of its parent. Now, if I instead take these and I switch these over to global rotation, now well, it's still influencing it some, but it shouldn't be as extreme. Essentially, the global rotation gives me a more predictable path for the limbs to interpolate through when it's doing this, almost like this local rotation. So in my mind, the way I view that global rotation is a kind of a mixture of IK and FK. We're kind of looking at those joints in world space to interpolate the path through, but we're getting these nice arcs. So for the limbs in particular, I don't think the global rotation necessarily matters as much with like inner spine segments and such. I could be wrong on that, but I really view from everything I understand from it as best to really choose that in the air for the arms and legs in particular. So I'm going to set that to global rotation. Let's go ahead and get into the ballistics. So a really cool feature here, and we're really starting to actually touch on the physics systems here inside of Cascadeur, is the ability to take all the collider information that we have and run some physics on it to see how our character is behaving. So, once again, if we go into our view mode here, we can see there's colliders and there's an actual physics layer to our characters. And up here at the top, we have this set of tools here. I'm going to essentially select the start frame or keyframe where my character is leaving the ground. And I'm just going to select the time range until that character plants on the ground. When I do that, so let's say here to here, I can now go up and just hit the little add button and I get this curve. Now, what this path is doing is it's essentially showing me the path of the bodies when they're essentially free or they're in the air. And that is physically accurate. So this is the path my character should take. And it's really the path that it should be taken based off of the center of mass of my character. So we can see one of the major issues that I have with my character right now is he's not really traveling the correct ballistics path of the motion. Now we can modify the path in a few ways. So if I want to make the character go higher, I can lift this up, or I could also modify the start and end positions. Specifically, as I adjust this in terms of the height, you're going to notice that down on the timeline, when you have created ballistics in the outliner, there's a ballistics object here. And in the timeline, you'll see above the selected range, we have this kind of gray line. So that represents the amount of flight time for my character. So if I shorten the path, the character should be in the air for less time, and therefore this gray line shortens. And if I stretch this out, the line extends. So one thing I could do if I want this character to be in the air for a longer period of time or higher, I could take this and then I can go ahead and stretch my timeline here. So I could just do Control T, and then I'll just grab this and stretch that out so that the actual duration matches what the ballistics duration should be. Notice when I do that right now, I have fixed keys enabled on interpolation, so it kind of made those fixed keys. So I'm going to turn that off so that that doesn't happen. So now my character is traveling, but not going as high as the character should. So the next thing I can do with my ballistics, if we go up here to the top menu, we expand that, we have a snap. So the snap will go in and it will make sure that that center of mass is traveling the ballistics path. We also get these ghosts that we can turn on and off. This also allows me to see how much my animation is properly matching the rotation that would happen in space. So when you create the ballistics, it looks at the kind of velocity and rotation of those colliders or those physics objects, and it should be able to determine what the rotation is for that character. In my case, we can see that my character is, in this pose in particular, really not aligned with where he should be aligned. So essentially, the closer we get to blue, the more the character is aligned. And then as we get away from blue, the more problematic that pose is. So it's really up to me if I want to correct this or not. So if I want this to be physically accurate, I could select my character on this pose and kind of rotate it until these line up and release. And it's going to be showing uh, a better color range here. Now I could go in here and I could try to do this for each of my poses here to get something correct. Or if I want, I could just go over here to the top and I could just snap the ballistics like so. And yeah, and then I go ahead and just hit snap. And now my character is rotating. Of course, now because of the rotation, changing my actual travel path for center of gravity is wrong. So we want to go ahead and snap that again like this. So there we go. You'll notice when I do that snap, I do get the fixed key happening. Now I thought that that would only happen if this is enabled. It still seems to be happening here. So I'm gonna go ahead and just set that back to Bezier interpolation, but at least the key poses are kind of hitting where they should hit. It's actually not that big of a deal to go ahead and leave it as fixed keys because, once again, we've learned that due to this this edit mode here, it's really easy to still modify dense keyframe data. So this gets me a physically accurate jump when I'm in the air. There are priority keys here, so if you have something complex, you can flag certain poses as being more critical than others while you're in the air, and that'll help the solver try to reach the priority frames that you have set. That's something I actually haven't explored that much, so I can't speak much on that. Once you're happy with the results, you can always select your ballistics object and just delete it from the scene to clear that data out. All right, so I think this is a good stopping point for us. We're just about to get into the physics system, and I've decided this video is long enough. I've already started working on part 3, so it should be coming around a lot faster than the time between part 1 and part 2, and that's going to be dedicated just to the physics systems and all the things you can do. It might be a little bit more of a deep dive than what I've been trying to do with this being a speed run. Of course, there's also still the topic of getting your characters in and out of Cascadeur, so we'll be looking at importing and exporting characters and the rigging tools, and we'll do that in part 4 video. Until next time, good luck with those animations.